Member supported, UNC TV.
Adventure requires a trusted guide. Find yours at PBS.
The Last Word in North Carolina legislative coverage returns for its 18th season. Join Kelly McCullen for North Carolina Now Legislative Week in Review, beginning Friday, May 18th, only on member-supported UNC TV.
A small southern airline that set the pace for great accomplishments. A puddle jumper that grew into an international carrier. A doubtful success that was honored as Airline of the Year. Through obstacles that would have grounded most companies, Piedmont Airlines takes off into history as an example of a company that was more than a business. It was a personal statement by every employee to give their best, and together earned the reputation as a can-do airline with a legacy that shines as brightly as ever. For its customers, Piedmont Airlines supplied a reliable service and a friendly face. For its leadership, an expression of their ethics. For its workers, a family. Their quest remains unique in American business. Their story, a model of how good an airline can be. At the dawn of the 20th century, a new age of wonders had begun. On the coast of North Carolina, the Wright brothers leapt into the new century, proving heavier than air flight possible. Aviation quickly became a fascination, as well as the era's most advanced technology, spurring enthusiasts to take up the pursuit of flight. In the Piedmont of North Carolina, two progressive communities, the old Moravian village of Salem and the New South Industrial Center of Winston, were blending and flourishing. R.J. Reynolds had already built a tobacco empire, sweeping the country with a new cigarette brand called Camel in 1913. The same year, a golden hyphen linked the two towns permanently.
By the time that R.J. Reynolds married Catherine Smith in 1905, Winston-Salem was the largest city and probably one of the more prosperous cities in North Carolina.
Well, it was a town that already was a major manufacturing center, but it was a town that was also on the verge of exploding because of new businesses.
And it was pretty much the economic powerhouse of North Carolina at the time. Winston-Salem, because of its prominence in the state, was the site of air shows. It was a destination for barnstormers. The Reynolds family was very involved early on in aviation.
I think the Reynolds role in it is more their enthusiasm about aviation. It was contagious and people caught it.
That enthusiasm helped secure a new airport for Winston-Salem, built to welcome the nation's newest hero, aviation icon Charles Lindbergh.
This was the only official stop for the Lindbergh tour in North Carolina. They threw him in a limo and took him down to Haynes Park. A crowd estimated at 25,000 people turned out to hear Lindbergh speak.
After Lindbergh spoke at Haynes Park, the crowd splintered the bleachers that had been built for the event. and took them as souvenirs.
In the crowd that day was a 9-year-old boy whose every ambition centered around flying. His name was Tom Davis.
I think he was just an all-American boy. He would save, he had little jobs here and there. He had a little vegetable stand and sold apples on the side of the road and stuff, and trying to make a little spare money, and would save it, and apparently went out and took a couple of flying lessons, and probably 14, 15 years old.
Tom remembered that one of his first flights was piloted by a barnstormer who flew him over Sunny Knoll, his family home on Renolda Road. He said it was quite a thrill. Through high school, Tom honed his skill in the air. Stories were told how Tom would fly over to Greensboro on Saturdays, taxiing his J3 Cub into a drive-in for a hamburger.
He came from a prominent family. My grandfather was an extremely sharp businessman, was with Reynolds Tobacco when he started, and then started a securities life insurance company, but was still just down-to-earth type people. Dad was a family man, and I think his parents instilled in him the importance of the family.
I came home for lunch from high school one day, and my father said to me right out of the blue, "Why don't you go out and take a flying lesson this afternoon?" I'll never know whether he had found out that I had been saving my allowance just for that purpose, and in fact had already secretly taken 2 or 3 flying lessons. In any event, he didn't say anything about it, and I didn't either. But I didn't waste any time getting out to the airport.
He went to the University of Arizona in Tucson for his asthma, respiratory problems. He had had asthma when he was young, and he'd gone out for a summer vacation for a few weeks and just felt so much better when he was there. And they decided that would be a great place for him to attend college. He'd go out to the airport and got a part-time job delivering newspapers from an airplane. They had some kind of route where they had a little Cub or something and go to some of the distant towns and throw bundles of newspapers out the window of the Cub. And so he was doing that, and he was giving also flying lessons.
Though he had studied medicine at the University of Arizona, Tom Davis returned home in the summer of 1939 and began to follow his passion. Back in Winston-Salem, he took a job as a salesman for Camel City Flying Service, owned by L.S. Mac McGinnis.
Mac had been my flight instructor 4 years earlier, before I went away to college, and operating as Camel City Flying Service, had obtained the North Carolina State Distributorship franchise for the famous Piper Cub and Stinson-reliant aircraft. The pre-med training I had received at the University of Arizona was quickly forgotten, and I jumped at the chance to get paid to fly rather than having to rent an airplane to build up my flying time. One of my most vivid memories as an airplane salesman happened in the fall of 1940. We had a prospect in Mount Airy, and since there was no airport there, I had been using a cow pasture along the side of a small stream just north of town. After a demonstration flight with my customer, we were sitting on a log just outside the fence, and I was giving him the old sales pitch. About that time, I noticed the wings of my airplane rocking back and forth, and I got up to see what could be causing that, and I've never seen such a big black bull in my life. He had his head up under the wingtip on the other side, and he was rocking his horns back and forth like this, and this poor little airplane was sitting there shaking. And it was the brightest, shiniest red Cub coupe you've ever seen. I could just visualize that bull plowing through the side of my beautiful little airplane, so I jumped over the fence and tried to scare him off with waving my briefcase at him. All he did was lower his head, start snorting, and pawing the ground as if I was the next target. It occurred to me that the only possible way I could frighten him off was perhaps by the noise of the engine. In those days, there were no starters on most airplanes, and to start them, you had to go around and pull the propeller through with a sharp pull. I ran around to the other side, reached in and turned on the switch, went back around in front of the airplane, pulled the prop through with all the strength that I could muster, hoping and praying all the time that the engine would start on the first pull. It did, and with that noise, the bull turned tail and ran bucking and kicking across the field. Without a word to my prospect, I jumped in the airplane and took off. I never did see that prospect again. I never did land in that pasture again, and I never did get that order. That's about the time I decided I wanted to be an officer instead of a salesman.
By 1939, It was clear that Mac was not going to be able to generate enough profit to even pay back the note. At that point, he owed Dick over $14,000. And that was when Charlie Norfleet came up with the idea of selling Camel City to Tom Davis.
Dick had loaned McGinnis the funds to start Camel City Flying Service, but he was having a pretty difficult time ever getting repaid. One day, Charlie called me down to the office and asked if I would be interested in becoming more permanently and financially involved in the aviation business. And if so, Dick would like to talk to me. So that afternoon, I went by Dick's house, and he suggested that if I would pay off Mac's note, he would see that I became the principal stockholder of the company. That event led to the dissolution of Camel City Flying Service and the formation of Piedmont Aviation Incorporated on July 2nd, 1940.
Davis already was showing that he had a broader ambition for the company than just as a Winston-Salem company. Mac had named the company Camel City Aviation because Camel City was Winston-Salem's nickname after the Camel cigarettes that R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company manufactured. But technically, the Piedmont extends anywhere up the eastern seaboard where the Appalachians start descending into the coastal plain. And he knew if he named his aviation company Piedmont, it would have a broader geographical reach and would set the stage for growth. And so that was one of the first things he did. At that time, the franchise agreements for engines, for airplanes, things like that, were held by a person, not by a company. And the person that owned those agreements was Mac McGinnis. For Camel City to thrive under its new ownership, they somehow had to keep Mac McGinnis in the loop. Also, there was a consideration of the personal relationship between Reynolds and Mac McGinnis, and as a courtesy, they needed to keep him involved somehow. As it turned out, they ended up keeping Mac as president, but all the power really resided with Tom Davis.
McGinnis was an excellent mechanic and an excellent pilot on it, but I had a volatile temperature, and he'd blow up in a minute. And you kind of had to expect that from him. But he was one of the better mechanics around. In fact, he was a mechanic on Lindbergh's airplane, getting it ready for the night before he left on his crossing the Atlantic.
Tom Davis got lucky when the war came. Davis had been teaching flight instruction at Piedmont, and he ramped that up and succeeded in winning a contract to train pilots during the war. And that kept the company alive throughout the war. And in fact, they grew quite a bit during that period. They had to buy quite a lot of airplanes and maintenance capability to keep the planes going. And they put well over 1,000 pilots through the school during the war years.
The civilian pilot training program readied pilots for military service. Piedmont Aviation secured 3 separate contracts for training, including a group of Latin American students who spoke little English. Flight instructor Zeke Saunders found a creative way to explain maneuvers to his trainees.
I drew those signs all over the side of the top of the airplane and point to them on, and Mr. McGinnis, who was president of Piedmont at the time, didn't like me drawing pictures on the airplane, so he fired me. But Tom Davis came by and said, forget about going back to work.
In 1943, a change of leadership took place, catapulting Tom Davis to president of Piedmont Aviation. Mac McGinnis left the company. The following year, a new direction was charted as the end of the Second World War was in sight. 26-year-old Tom Davis planned to start an airline.
Piedmont Aviation had this active flight training program that was going very well, and all of a sudden the federal government canceled the programs because they felt they had enough pilots at that time. That really was quite a crisis. That's when Tom Davis began to think, well, let's start a passenger service.
Trying to get permission to start an airline in 1944 was very difficult. At the time, airlines were regulated like a public utility. The Civil Aeronautics Board decided who could have an airline, where they would fly, what times they would fly, and what they would charge. And so in order for Davis to start an airline, he had to put in an application. Of course, he wasn't the only one who wanted to start an airline after the war. In the Southeast alone, there were some 26 companies that put in applications, not to mention 8 existing airlines that put in applications to beef up their service. The CAB had to wade through all of these because it was going to pick and choose who it would give what's called a certificate of operations to.
Finally, Piedmont got a green light. Southern Airlines and Piedmont were the only 2 airlines that were authorized by the CAB to begin passenger service. All that finally came through in 1947. In the meantime, State Airlines, which was owned and operated by Hank Gilbert in Charlotte, felt strongly that his state airline should have been chosen instead of Piedmont.
State Airlines challenged the CAB's decision to give a certificate to Piedmont on the grounds that the CAB had pretty much tossed out the window the routes that Piedmont had applied for in its certificate and awarded Piedmont some other routes that it wanted it to fly. So it assigned 4 routes to Piedmont, none of which were the routes that Piedmont had originally applied for. State said they couldn't do that. The CAB denied their appeal. They appealed to the Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. The Court of Appeals upheld State Airlines, and that put Piedmont in a quandary because the Court of Appeals decided to issue an injunction staying the CAB's certificate.
All of a sudden, when Hank Gilbert initiated this lawsuit, then Piedmont had to put everything on hold. It was a very, very difficult time because, at one point they had a lot of momentum going. They had built the ticket counters. They had hired a staff, including some experienced folks from Eastern. Actually, their official beginning was delayed about a half a year while this case kept going through the courts.
We started hiring pilots, and we had them on the payroll and had them trained. We decided we didn't want to let them go, so we gave them very little salary because we wasn't making a lot of money. So they stayed on and did a lot of work and flying some on the side too with charter and training.
We knew what the situation was. We were aware that they were having quite a battle in the courts over the certificate. Of course, we knew that if it didn't go in favor of Piedmont, we had to look elsewhere for something to do. And at that time,